Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm just here to introduce.
Eco.
Ouve-se muito mal.
Okay. And now, can you hear me?
Sim.
Okay. Sorry, technical problems. It's a lifetime of. Okay, so I won't speak much because we are all here to hear you, not me. I'm just formally opening the panel. Okay. Formally opening the panel, and now on it will be Professor Tomás Vieira Silva that will host the session, and I will leave it to you. Really, the entire session to all of you. I'll be leaving now, and we can't wait to hear you. Okay, bye.
Can I start? Yeah, I think. Okay, I'm fine. Good afternoon, everyone that's watching us on this time zone. To everyone else, good morning or good evening or good night. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much to the Faculty of Fine Arts of the University of Porto for hosting this event, even though most of us, if not all of us, are online. And today we have, for this first roundtable of the What If International World History Conference, we have three fantastic guests who come from very different fields, but we are all here together to talk about alternative history. So first, I'm just going to say a couple of words about each speaker, and then I'll give the floor to each to present their own research. First, we have Professor Mário Mesquita from the Faculty of Architecture of the University of Porto. He holds a bachelor degree in architecture, a master's in urban environment planning and design, and a PhD in architecture from the University of Porto. He's also a researcher at one of the other hosts, the Research Institute for Art, Design and Society. Thank you so much, Mário, for being with us. We also have Professor Cynthia Montaudon from the University, the UPAEP in Puebla, Mexico. She's a professor at the Business School of the University and also a consultant. She has studied extensively on business and strategic planning. She holds PhDs in actual business and strategic planning and several research postgraduate degrees in several fields. She's also the head of the Observatory for Competitiveness and New Ways of Working. And last and surely not the least, we have Professor Alfred Barrens, who was with us in the first international meeting 2 years ago at the Rectory of the University of Porto. He is a lecturer at the University of Salamanca, he's a guest speaker, a writer, he's also the president of the Strategic Council of the University, Fernando, Pessoa, and he has studied extensively also on economics, holding a bachelor degree in economics, a master's in international economics and international development, and a PhD in economics from the University of Cambridge. And because I'm not going to speak too much today, I'll give the floor to Professor Mário Mesquita from our own University of Porto.
Okay. Good afternoon to everybody. First thing, since we are here, one Portuguese, one Mexican, and one Brazilian, we speak in Portuguese or in Spanish?
I have to say that this is a conference that is being streamed to, we don't really know who's exactly watching. I know that there are people in the Netherlands watching that do not speak each yes. of the language. Last year we had people from the Philippines, for example, watching us. So we're trying to focus on the English as our working language.
Okay, so I'll try to be brief. Okay, let's start 15 minutes from now. I'm going to start reading my introduction. So the title is What If Ricardo Jorge Didn't Exist? Would have Oporto resisted to the 1899 plague and developed as a modern city? The public health physician Ricardo Jorge evaluated public hygiene health in Portugal. We high point in importance and repercussion the control of the 1899 plague in Porto. Ricardo Jorge was the first to expose the problem. A whole set of urban health actions took place till 1909, 1914, based on its sewage system. He was personally menaced by the revolt of the populations in face of the economical military confinement. His lucidity, knowledge, bravery helped to put an end to a 30 years sanitary problem. We highlight the action of a single man who, if he had not existed, perhaps Porto would not have the same health urban development. Using a qualitative and research action methodology, we will deal with the Compagnie Générale des Eaux and Hughes and Lancaster archival to conclude that their action would have never been so valued if there had been someone to arouse interest in public health issue. We'll apply this in collection in the memory of the world by UNESCO. This is the point, okay? We've got a figure, we've got a person. What if he didn't exist? What if he wasn't a very important person in sanitary health and including in public urbanism? And what would have happened to Porto as a city if it didn't exist? He was a very important physician. He was in Oporto since the late 19th century, and he was just fighting sorry, just a little moment. Because I'm just talking from the company, from the water company, and there's some people entering in his room. Sorry by the delay. I'm just talking from the installations of the company that heritage that important work of this physician, and heritage all the subjects that were submitted to the contest that occurred in the late in the 1881 and in 1897, just to put on working the water system in Oporto and the sewage system also in Oporto. What's the role of this physician? If he didn't care about this city, if he didn't care about this population, if he wasn't walking on the street and just put some order in the streets, I would say we would have been living a circumstance that was very similar to nowadays, when we are just facing a pandemic wave. Oporto was on a pandemic wave, not a pandemic, but an epidemical wave, and the science, the role of science was very important, just to make clear that the problems of the city and the problems of the image of the city just pass for not they are not exclusively from the urbanistic side, they are also from the sanitary side. So that's the situation we are now living in the world in this pandemic wave. So I think there's some similar things between what happened 120 years ago, what is happening now. We've got the same role of the military forces and the same role of the physicians, and the science has been contested, and there's including nowadays some people in high developed countries like Netherlands, like Germany, like Austria, that don't care about the vaccine, and that's a problem. That's a very a very big problem in public health. So, what was the role of this physician? One day he was walking in a street, and he was visiting some patients, and he detected a focus in the city. So he get alarmed. The problem was the city was a very financial city with lots of banks and with a very strong economical power in the north of Portugal and in the country also. And his opinion was not very well received, because if the city closed, literally closed, all those economical nets would be just put down, and it wouldn't be just a city very growing in the way that that it grew. The first reaction of the people was to just to try to kill him also. He was very menaced by he got lots of menaces by a lot of people, just when he was working on the profit of the public health. So that's the real problem here. What would happen to the city, what would happen to the country, including if a person like this didn't exist. Why is he important, for instance, in the process of the sewage in the town? He's important because he called the attention of the public domain, just to take care of the town, just watching to the infrastructure, that where was the plague, the real plague was under the ground, was in the water. So there's some works just presented to the medical school where he presented his thesis, and as a city physician, he was responsible for all the combat that the people make to get off the plague. What happened then? In 1899, this plague obliged a military, how could I say it? The army just surrounded the city, okay, and the city was literally surrounded by a period of 6 months, and the problem was the city was just not leading very well with this situation. This doctor was the person everybody just was the first person that everybody just how could I say it in English, just identified with the plague, and identified with the problems, with economical problems on the city. What happened to him? He made the possible works here in Porto, and then he went to Lisbon. He went to Lisbon just to work in another city, because it was not it was not possible just working here in Oporto in that place. But if he was, that's the problem. If he didn't work on this infrastructure problems, and but not paid attention to this problem, nowadays I think Porto didn't exist, wouldn't exist, just like it was. It would be another history, and that's the point when we study this figure, and we study the role of the water supplies in Oporto and the sewage supplies in Oporto. They are inseparable, and we've got to look at this person, just not if it was a saint, if it was a unique person, but it would be really different if he didn't pay the attention, if he didn't include it with bravery, just confronted just face it the problem with all the strength he had. What happened to him? So he went to Lisbon, and it was very important in the crisis of another epidemical crisis that happened in 1918, the Spanish flu, and nowadays the principal institute of public health has his name. That's a name we don't know. Most of people doesn't know the history of him, and doesn't know the role he had in this, in all these problems. So what if it didn't exist? That's the problem. Would have been another person just with knowledge and strong enough just to face the crisis? We don't know. Perhaps yes, but it was not credible because he had a technical education and a physician education that made him unique in a time where when everybody was just looking to the other side. Let's say we were in the passing through of the 19th century into the 20th century, and all the society was split. The society was split between the poor people and the rich people. And in Oporto, he cared a lot about the poor people because the problems didn't affect directly the rich people. But 2 years ago, the rich people just understood that if the poor people didn't have good conditions of health, the rich people would be affected with this problem. So they gave the reason to the musician, to the physician, and they gave him the reason, and his work was recognized, I would say 40 years ago from that time, just like how much everything in Portugal happens. He needed to be recognized outside the country, including just to be recognized here. And he was never recognized in Porto till the 1974 revolution, when it was founded here, the delegation of the Instituto Ricardo Jorge. That's the name, and that's now the name, including of when we are facing this COVID situation. It is the biggest lab where these questions are just treated. So what happened if a person like him didn't exist? I would say first we wouldn't have the just built in time the sewage system in the town. We wouldn't have a clear relation between labs and water in the town. We wouldn't have identified the problem, and we wouldn't have fight the problem in the just time, in the right time. Just let me say, for instance, there was what happened then. It was not visible. The plague was not visible because it was in the poor side of the town. But he had the bravery and the courage to go to that part of town and just to explore that problem. And we had some houses, including that were destroyed because it wasn't possible just to clean those houses just to expel the plague. What happened if it didn't exist? I would say the municipality was not prepared just to face a crisis like this, and the medical school was not enough here in Oporto, was not enough prepared just to study those problems. So he is really, I think, a single person, and very important in physician terms, in urbanistic terms, and including in the image of the town we have today. We have today an image of town where everything goes under the soil. Infrastructure are very important in the construction of the town, and I think that's related to his action too. Okay, 15 minutes are over.
Thank you very much, Mario. That was quite illuminating. Like you said, I think most of us, people from Porto, do not really, Portuguese in general are not really aware of the role Ricardo Jorge played and still plays today. And now I give the floor to Alfredo. Alfredo, please. You are with your mic off. You have to unmute. No, you're still unmuted. You're still muted. Sorry, Alfredo. You are still, wait. We cannot hear you, Alfredo. I don't think he's listening to us.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay,
perfect.
Good. Sorry, there was talk that I might die before this seminar is over, but no, that was greatly exaggerated, and I will remain with you until the end. Okay. Thank you very much, Ana Pessoa, for inviting me, the Faculty of Beautiful Arts, for hosting this, Mario, for your beautiful talk. I have something to say roughly along the same lines. A person that was not listened to in time and made us waste an enormous amount of time as a result of that. When I submitted the abstract to this meeting, this work that I'm going to present now was just an idea. Since we have set up a team that I will mention later, and so the work that I have here is not only mine, sorry, still I won't die. The idea was that it is a joint piece of work, and it's still very much in the making. We are about to publish it, but we still have some nails to hit hard. So please do not quote us as is, right? This is the big idea of this. Now, what is it that we have to mention here? Very much like the life of Ricardo Jorge. There was a very prominent economist in late 19th century, 1880 actually, 1870 perhaps, William Stanley Jevons. He was the professor which was considered to be foundational in the area of quantitative economics. He was very unsatisfied with the explanation of the trade cycles in England. He thought that there was too much in common between them as to be ignored. So he suggested that the cycles that were affecting business in England may result from sunspots. He was way beyond the time. So he was ostracized. He was laughed out of court. He lost all his standing. Even his son tried to reinstate his father into his former glory in the early 20th century, but got nowhere. Even when I was studying economics, Jevons, which was the name of this professor, was thought of with a smirk. Not really to be taken seriously. And that was a shame. It was a shame because actually what had happened was that since the Protestant reform, I will amplify this a little so that you can see it, agency was within the individual. Ever since John Locke, for example, the individual pursued self-interest. This got a bit constrained from then onwards. First of all, by Rousseau and the social contract, and then by Kant and the categorical imperative. And the story went on to Marx. Essentially, society became the great constraint, but never beyond society. And what Jevons was suggesting was that actually society did not matter as much. What mattered was the sun. At that time, it's understandable because agriculture was very important. But ever since then, agriculture receded in importance and industrialization grew, as well as the consumption of fossil fuels. And perhaps we would have continued along this route if it were not for Greta and all the environmentalists. And now we realize that this is no longer possible and that perhaps it is important to bring back the sun into the picture. This is what this is about. So why is it that we are interested in this? Let me see if I can just name my co-authors here. Is Carolina Zilli Vieira, who is a research fellow at Harvard at the School of Public Health, very much like Ricardo Jorge. Caizó Beltrão, a professor of statistics in Rio de Janeiro, and Agostinho Almeida, a criminologist and professor here in Porto. Now, what is it that we are dealing with? Homicides. Why homicides? Because we really are interested in human behavior. Very much like Jevons was suggesting that sunspots influenced trade cycles, we are working with our fingertips. We don't really have funding and we just want to explore. And to explore, we need data. And the data that we have access to is published. And what is published on human behavior is homicides. Why? Because homicides are very important. They're a reason for major concern. And this is what we are dealing with here. Homicides. Why? Because this attracts a lot of attention. So sociologists come with a lot of explanation about this, all about social deprivation. People that live in violent ghettos are more prone to commit homicides, or that there has been an erosion of social control with divorce rates increasing and people being born out of wedlock. And there are more drugs now than there were then. And then there are race issues, and guns and age structure. All these things are very important. Now, if we look at trends, because all those things are important to explain homicides in place, but they don't really help us much to understand the rates of homicide along the time in different countries, in different cultures. So here what we have here is this graph, which if you look at it rather quickly, might not mean much to you. But we see that there are ups and downs in those curves there. The lowest one, just by chance, because this is the way that I have drawn it, and it's relatively flat, but it's not that flat, is the American one, which actually in terms of rates of murder, it's actually 4 to 5 times higher than in Germany and the UK, which are pictured on the other axis, the one at the right-hand side. But I won't waste much time on you because it's not really easy to see much around it. What happens is that when sociologists, criminologists, psychologists, and other social scientists look at this, they come up with a certain attitude of we can't make sense of those trends. I won't waste your time reading this because I have summarized here. The complaints are that it seems that homicides have a random component, or that it's too much of a puzzle for us to solve, and that there is no consensus, or that the statistics are not reliable enough. Those are explanations of frustration. So what we have here is a situation in which the anomalies in the homicides pile up, and the conventional theory, the conventional approach to explain the problem is not enough. This is what we have learned to call a Copernican moment. Now, why is this important? Because it's essential to see the forest from the trees. So what we have come up with, and this is the same graph that I showed you before, only that with, oops, sorry, missed it. Can you see me? Yes?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can, Alfredo. We can see you.
There is back the graph. So what do we have here? The same graph that I showed you before, with all these ups and downs. And below, in yellow bars, I have drawn the expression of the solar cycles, what Jevons was talking about 120 years ago. So what is this? The sun has cycles, and those cycles are expressed in what we call here on Earth solar storms. These are oscillations of the geomagnetic fields in the Earth. Now, humanity has now been on this planet for very, very long. The human people as a species have become accustomed to these solar storms, except when they are too strong. When they're too strong, they possibly provoke an destabilization of the organism, of the human organism, that leads to people behave in a different way. So what you see in that graph is that when you have intense solar storms, as in yellow in those bars, there are upward kinks on the rate of homicides. The same when you have weak solar storms, there is a downward trend in the homicides. And again, when there is a more intense solar storm, there is an upward kink again. So it's impossible not to realize that there is some connection, like Jevons suggested over 100 years ago. So what is it that we have to keep in mind here? We are now hypothesizing that because we can see a graphical association between solar activity and its expression on Earth through the oscillations of geomagnetism, that they do have an impact on homicides. We are interested in human behavior, but what we can show is homicides, right? So this is what we are after. Carolina Zilli Vieira came to our help here, and she suggests that when the solar storms are too strong, they throw the circadian rhythm of the human organism into a disequilibrium, and this excites our sensation of fight or flight, which eventually gets transmitted to our autonomous nervous system, and this is expressed in anxiety, anger, and aggressiveness. So this is the mechanism. You have solar activity, solar-driven geomagnetic oscillations on the Earth, and these throw into disequilibrium the human organism. And if we throw this into statistics database and we do the analysis, what we have is these graphs here. Now, look at where it says R squared. This is a measure of the explanation of the variance of the variable that we want to explain, which is the homicide rate. Now, we have reached, with the data that is published, yearly data, a very robust result for Germany and for the US. Over half of the variance of homicides rates is explained by the geomagnetic disturbances. We did not do as well in the UK, but for social sciences, it's acceptable. We're still working on that. We're going to improve it. Now, what we had hypothesized is that there is an impact on homicides due to the geomagnetic disturbances. And with these regressions, we have come very close to explain it. Now, if we look into this, our regressions are robust, but do they meet the big test? And which is the big test? A big test in science must allow for control, replicability, and prediction. Now, we are not in control because solar activity is not in the human mind control. Our approach is replicable. Many countries, different timeframes for our homicides rates, perhaps monthly instead of yearly, but you have to go and hunt for the data. And can we predict? Well, to some extent we can. We cannot still, not this week, but perhaps next week, predict how many people will be killed the next time, the next solar peak. But we can say when it will happen, because solar activities are very regular. And because of the time lags that we have found that exist, we suggest that in the next peak, solar peak, with a lagged difference of up to 4 years, we will have another peak in homicide rates. So soon we will say how many people will get killed, unfortunately, but we know when. So 120 years have gone by since Stanley Jevons. If we had paid attention to him earlier, like the people that denied the importance of what Ricardo Jorge was suggesting, if we had been more accepting of deviant thoughts, then perhaps we would have realized that we are not alone in this planet earlier than we have come to realize. And we have taken into account the very important impact that solar-driven geomagnetic disturbances seem to have on the human organism. Now, if you don't believe me, look at what is called the legal executions, legal homicides. This data does not include China, which kills a lot of people. But if you look at this, it's also, again, it seems to have peaks and curves. And if we superimpose, like I did, the curves of the sunspots, look at that. The more intense sunspots leads to more executions. 2 out of 3, it's not a bad explanation if you only work with your fingertips and with published data. So you see, there is some method in our madness. Are we talking only of homicides or executions? No, I believe this is also shown to be expressed on schizophrenic onsets, in riots, in strikes, in revolutions, and perhaps also in wars. So this is important because it doesn't only affect human beings, does it? It affects all living organisms on Earth. If you stop to think, why do whales beach themselves in large numbers at certain times of the year? It is a surprise to us all. Why do some birds lose their direction when they're migrating? Not birds, also crabs, some reptiles. As soon as we start realizing that we are not alone in this planet and that we have a lot in common with all the other species that live in it, we're going to have a completely different way of looking into life on our planet. We lost a lot of time by laughing at Jevons. It is time that we make up for that lost time. Thank you very much. I would love your support. I would love to hear your ideas, and I would love to work with you in the future if there is a chance. Thank you very much for paying attention to me at this time.
Thank you so much, Alfredo. Muito obrigado. And now I'll give the floor to Cynthia. Cynthia, please.
Thank you very much. It was such a fun conversation that you had. You presented information in such a way that I was just laughing. It was really, really interesting and exciting. I'm going to do it in a way that's more traditional. I'm going to be speaking about particular applications of alternative histories in management. So let me just share my screen. Okay, there we go. So basically, I'm going to be talking about how to build better businesses using alternative histories in benchmarking. And my colleague Anna Amsler is teaching right now, so she couldn't be here today. And when we talk about benchmarking, this sometimes is a term that creates kind of a stir or noise or even confusion. We might think of a bench and a mark, and sometimes essentially that is it. But the confusions that it creates is that sometimes people say, oh, this should be associated maybe with sports. So maybe we should be checking the other team's bench to see who's benched and who's not. But as I said, there's something about the bench and something about the mark. And in fact, we see benchmarks everywhere. And benchmarks are normally used for land surveying. And when people want to build a bridge or maybe level the ground, they need to establish these marks clearly. And they're everywhere. We stand on them while they walk on the streets. We see them on walls. And almost every single country in the world has their particular benchmarks everywhere. So this is kind of considering where this idea of benchmark came from. And we also have very famous benchmarks. This is benchmark A. And it establishes the height above mean sea level, both for the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. But when we move it more into modern day life and also in management, if we talk a bit of the history, benches were also used kind of to standardize manufacturing. You could fix things so that you can have a reference and then manufacture could be done in mass, replicating different pieces. So benchmark became a measure of quality essentially. So as I said, it was used to level lands and the leveling surveys that occur very frequently. And it had a special use in the manufacture of guns and ammunition, because at the beginning, guns and ammunition were done basically by chance. You wouldn't know whether it would work or not until you try it. So it was better to create a standardized system that would avoid killing people, especially when trying the arms just to see whether the weapons were fit for use or not. And if we move more into the quality improvement part or management, we can see that this benchmarking started with reverse engineering in the 1950s, but then it acquired a huge boom with Xerox company, the one that manufactures photocopiers. They started having problems with their products in different regions, and they realized that the problem was that there were companies that were manufacturing a far better product and that was cheaper and that yielded more in terms of ink and didn't have any problems with the papers. So what they did was go to Japan and find out who were these manufacturers, and they bought some of their equipment and they put it piece by piece to understand how they were working, and they analyzed their processes and they analyzed their cost system. And then what they did was kind of started copying whatever they were doing, and they became the #1 company. And what was very good about this is that they realized that they didn't have to start from zero in generating this knowledge about how to create something better or how to improve. It was just easy to see how the others who were already at the top had done it, and just then you have a leap in which you don't have to work through all that progress, the progress that the others did, or all that research, to just copy what others had done. And so that was kind of the essence, to try to replicate the practices of others by comparing yourself to what others have already done. And this benchmarking idea also comes from comparing oneself to whomever is the best in class. So you won't compare to somebody who's worse than you, because there's no comparison to be made. Not to others that are at the medium level. What you want is the top. So therefore you can improve and be at that level. Then in the 1980s, benchmarking was more located into analyzing processes, how people do things. And we realized that there are a lot of different processes that became so famous that they became systems, such as the Toyota system and the Ford system. It was processes or ways of doing things that were basically replicated by everyone around the world. So it was not just a company, the process itself became replicated. And then in the late 80s, benchmarking became more strategic, so it became incorporated into the strategy of a business, but also it started to have a global perspective. Why? Because companies started to go global, so we had to consider these global standards. And benchmarking, by essence, it's nothing but making meaningful comparisons with others based on this idea that we want to improve. And what we do is search for the best practices out there, and we evaluate or measure something in comparison to that and to the standard that we want to achieve. So basically it comes to a consulting tool that helps set objectives to evaluate a company's performance against the market leaders, to compare one's performance to others, and also to gain insights of how well we're doing or how bad we're doing in a specific situation. Surprisingly enough, if you look at different authors who talk about benchmarking, there's no clear idea about how many different types of benchmarking there are. Some say 3, others say more than 10. A benchmarking can be made internally or externally, so I can maybe analyze my internal company and compare one area to another, see how the processes are different, or I can do it with external companies. It can be done in a formal way or informally. So just to check how are we, but not necessarily analyzing the truth data so that we can actually have something to compare with. It can be done in a competitive way or a non-competitive. So maybe I do want to become better than the other, or I just want to know whatever they're doing. And we can analyze processes, products, performance, how we function, the strategy, the operations, the global dynamic. Now, of course, we have digital benchmarking because everything is going digital. And also we can have generic benchmarkings. But the most famous 3, or the ones that most companies do, are basically the process, the performance, and the strategic benchmarking. And the basic process is you ideally select what to benchmark, because we cannot benchmark everything. It would take too long to analyze everything and compare everything to others. We decide which organizations or companies we want to benchmark with. We document everything about the current and previous processes, and we collect and analyze data. When we incorporate alternative histories, we're going to collect certain narratives here. I'm going to get to that in a second. And we measure performance against the collected data that we have. Based on that, we establish a plan on how we want to proceed, how we want to implement the changes, and then if needed, we will repeat the process, because the idea behind benchmarking is also a continuous improvement. So when we talk about alternative histories and understand how we can put them into benchmarking, they are a window on how we understand the past, and they're invisible histories that everybody has, but nobody talks about them. And in business, this is very important, because this talks about all the problems that people have faced in the past, all the regrets, all the mishaps. So there are a lot of emotional issues connected to those invisible histories if something had been done different. These are also interactive pasts that can be modified, because if we want to change for the better, we need to understand what we could have changed in the past. It's also a substitute course of events. So we change whatever we want to produce different results. And there are different ways to analyze this perspective. For example, Nicolas Taleb, he proposed this idea of the Russian roulette, in which he said if there's a gun with 6 rounds of ammunition, and I mean 1 round of ammunition and 5 empty spaces, then you will have, if you play the Russian roulette, at the end you will have 5 enriching roulette and 1 statistics, 1 dead, right? So what's interesting here about using the alternative histories, especially for management in change creation or inducing change in organizations, is that history doesn't always prepare us for the future. So we can incorporate new ideas, and once we look back, we realize that there were things that could have been done different. And he also introduces this idea of we need to play with black swans. And looking at our current situation, we're actually playing in one of the biggest black swans of our era. Some years ago, no one expected there would be in a pandemic and that the pandemic would last 2 years. This was a black swan, something that might never happen. But we now realize that these events are more frequent than we might think of. So these are things that we need to include in our planning when we do business analysis. And one of the current trends in benchmarking is saying, why do we always have to compare ourselves with others? Is there really significant that what others do? Could we really compare ourselves in terms of size, culture, and a lot of different elements in our company with the biggest competitors? Can we really establish that comparison? So some theories suggest that competitors don't matter that much because they're not like us. And in fact, it's all about how much or how well do we know our competitors. A lot of the information they're not going to be sharing with us. We might be doing a kind of industrial espionage or buying their products or do different things. But of course, there's a lot of information that the companies are not willing to share. So therefore, the comparison cannot be that valid. So a lot of the proponents of new benchmarking strategies suggest internal benchmarking because it's all about you. So if we want to become the best in class, be the best that you can be. So don't try to be as good as everybody or as somebody else. So think inside. And that's when we can actually use alternative histories in benchmarking. So this can actually help organizations establish this ideal version of themselves, understanding what they could have done differently in the past, because that kind of sets the momentum for future change. And this creates better strategies for present and also for the present and also for the future. And this can actually gives us clear information about where we are standing and where we are as a company. So also that's very important because histories and stories actually shape human abilities to change. And everybody has a story, and we all want to create those stories. We all want to become maybe the heroes in that stories. And all participants in the storytelling, when we create the alternative stories, become actors and drivers of change. And in this sense, we're using history or the story as a light. It's going to be highlighting the faults, illuminating the outliers, and also shining light on what we might think of the ideal vision of the company for the future. So for alternative stories to be used, we start by asking a series of questions in the previous plan of how we're going to establish the different steps of benchmarking, there comes a moment in which say, okay, we need to compare us with something. What are we comparing us with? And we suggest start to create a narrative there. So we start asking basic what if questions and other questions. So what if the present was different? What if we were the top competitors right now? What if we were the #1 company in our field? We need to understand how did it all start. So we start creating this alternative history of the company. And we start identifying, okay, who were the people involved? And immediately you will see that most participants will put themselves or place themselves in the position of a hero. And they try to reivindicate themselves in these alternative histories. And they try to fix whatever somebody else did wrong. And they even want to eliminate others. So if they know that somebody did something wrong, that person gets eliminated from the story, from the history. So we start asking, okay, what would the state of mind be? So to connect emotionally to those moments in which we might feel that we're on the top of the world because we did everything right. And also, what would the story about the product or the business or each thing that we select to benchmark would look like? And what would our numbers be? Where will we be? Will we be right now as a company? Will our numbers be impressive? How would should we have done to have these numbers at that level? And what got the company there essentially? Was it the people? Was it the process? What's behind all of this? And what's really interesting when we start asking these questions is that the consultant in essence becomes kind of the organizational doctor. And this has a very therapeutical effect because people tend to express all the bad things that happened and put the blame on everybody that deserved it, that at the moment the blame was not placed. And also they try to say, yes, but I said so. Like I could have been the one who put the company in this position, but nobody paid attention to me. So it's about vindication and regeneration of the business. So it's a lot of things. It's very emotional. And once they realize that there was a possibility actually of becoming the top, the company at the top of the list of competitors, then they realize that in the future they can actually do it. So these become kinds of a driver for change using this type of alternative histories. And the idea afterwards is, okay, now that you know that you could have been that top competitor, what are the changes that you will need to do now? And this helps really nail down the vision because they have a clear idea of where they could have been because they had created that story. And sometimes we actually ask them to recreate it in a form of a video to present it very briefly so that everybody understands it. And we work these histories in different ways. We can work them individually. And then we try to create a group history, creating some of the common elements that we see in the histories. And then we have the company history. And it's like they really stand by that as maybe that could have been our history. And another thing that we do is once we have the full history, we identify very important keywords in that history. So some words are connected to certain actions or to certain emotions or to where we should have been. And those elements, we then translate them into changing the mission and the vision of the company, stating now that we could have been the best and that we do have the chance to be the best. And now we create and establish a new cohesive story for the future. This story becomes communicated to everyone. So we get this onboarding that everybody wants to be part of the change. And we go back to the process of creating the plan. And there are a lot of different benefits in doing this. When we compare ourselves with ourselves and with the best possible outcome that we can have, we establish baseline metrics that are really precise because we know the data. So we have what is called the sure measure, which does not happen when we compare ourselves to others because we don't really know if this information that they're providing or that we obtain is really down to the statistics that we need. And here we now can focus on improving performance, keeping an eye on what the company can be and not on what others had done. So we can also avoid limitations and we can focus backward and forward and we can move in time with these new alternatives that we can create for the business. And this actually creates a systemic view for continuous improvement, because we know that we can go back to a different history every time either there's a failure, maybe if there's a crisis, if there's an important situation, if there's a new entrant to the industry, we can go back to histories and recreate one that shows us what we should have done so that we can take a different path for the future. So basically, this is how we can introduce alternative histories into benchmarking for management.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Thank you so much for this lovely presentation. All these three presentations were very rich and very different, but still we have very close topics and very convergent points. Just one note, Mario had to leave us earlier. He had a teaching commitment, so he will not be here for this discussion part. But let me start with a very specific question to you, Cynthia, if you don't mind. This is coming from me, more of the political theorist that I am, rather than the simple moderator. So isn't it a problem, or can it be a problem if we just focus on what we could be? Isn't it a problem focusing on that ideal?
It's what we could have been, because it's about the present. Imagine that today we are the top competitor. So it's actually projecting us from what we should have done into the present. But then the idea is, and now that we know that we can be the top, how can we project this into the future? So it becomes like the strategic plan for change.
Oh, I see. Okay, thank you very much. If you allow me, I'm going to actually build on this, the benchmarking and all of these decisions that go with assessing a company's performance. And think about, well, we have the individual role in two levels, right? We have the individual's role in the decisions taken by the board, by the directors of a company, and we have the individual's role as the customers of that company, right? And of the companies that are the clients of that main company. And from Alfredo's presentation, we see move from, okay, it's not always, and obviously Alfredo's research right now is focusing on homicides, but can we see solar storms having an impact on the circadian rhythms that will then affect a company's decisions, for example? So the CEO's decisions that will affect the company's performance.
You're asking me the question or no?
I can actually, for both of you, I think, Cynthia, would you start us off?
Sorry about that. It's interesting because the circadian rhythm is something that businesses, because it affects the way in which people work, how productive they can be. It has to do with how we establish different pauses along the workday so that people can actually function at their best. So circadian rhythm really affects us in terms of all our lives, personal lives, professional lives, and even whatever we want to do with our anger out there. Huh?
Yeah. Alfredo?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cynthia, for your beautiful presentation. I don't think there was anything conventional about it. I loved listening to you. Just picking up on Ricardo Jorge's presentation by Mario, is it? Mesquita?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. You know, during the pandemic, I think it was the yellow fever pandemic that affected much of Europe at that time, there was one Jewish Bulgarian family in Barcelona. There was nothing to benchmark about it because there was nothing before them. And this has something to do with Cynthia. Is how do we really innovate when there is nobody before us? This is something that we have to take into account. And this Jewish Bulgarian family in Barcelona decided that they could build on what they knew about Bulgaria and yogurt. And if they could make yogurt in Barcelona and feed the people in Barcelona, perhaps they will grow immunity against the yellow fever. And they did. And this family then was forced again to migrate, and they went to the US, and then they sold the factory in the US, and they went back to France, which was where they wanted to live. Now, this is the family that created Danone, right? I mean, everybody eats that yogurt today. And if you stop to think, it was a family of Jewish people migrated from Bulgaria that wanted to do something positive about what they had in France. So what type of benchmarking was there before? None. And this is something that we have to figure out, because if we really want to be the best out there, then when you really want to make it, you have to look outside. What problem is there that I want to solve, or I think I can, and then build around it. And it's not so much about benchmarking, because this would just tell you that you probably don't want to be second in performance, you want to be top. But, you know, when it gets to the place where you're second, the first one is pretty hard to beat, because as Cynthia was saying, they probably won't tell you everything about their business, because if not, it would be easy. What I think is very interesting about what she was suggesting is the idea of bringing out people to express themselves and to become protagonists in those stories by shaping the story that could have been decided upon earlier. There is an element of that which is a bit dangerous, Cynthia, is that it brings people to fight against each other rather than collaborate. So perhaps some idea of appreciative inquiry in which you ask people, what are you doing well instead of what you're doing wrong, that might pull to them the fore into collaborating rather than infighting. So circadian rhythms are, yes, very important, and I wouldn't underestimate them. I think that I have come across some ideas in business in which I have noticed that sometimes CEOs are expelled from that position for not doing well enough. But sometimes they're not in control. Because, you know, there has been a downturn in business, a downturn that perhaps could be ascribable to sunspots. Why not? Yes, I have shown that this might be possible. And you fire them. And these guys are not responsible. And if we are in a situation in which a person kills another one, but they are not fully responsible for their actions, what right do we have in punishing them? These are the things that we have to think afresh, because once we realize that we are fellow beings in this planet and we are not totally in control of what we do, that we are actually subjected to impulses that come from the sun and might be too strong for us to counteract, then how responsible are we? Turn the ball to you, Tomás.
Thank you, Alfredo. Thank you for your contribution. So so here, yeah, I mean, we take the agency from the individual and we give agency to the sun, right? In your, or we can give agency to the sun and take some responsibility from the individual, or yes, the entirety of the responsibility, right?
Not all responsibility, but a considerable amount.
Okay, so we see the sun as an external factor. And now, okay, I might be focusing too much on business, but businesses, companies are always affected by external factors. Do we see any similarity here between what can we blame on a company's performance and what we can blame on a single individual? Cynthia or Alfredo?
You said Cynthia first.
But go ahead, because I'm still thinking about it.
Okay. Listen, it is an important question, Tomás. It doesn't surprise me that it comes from you. We cannot de-responsibilize fully the individual. After all, you know, there are lots of companies out there. Some do better than others, and they're all subjected to the same influence from the sun. So something they must be doing better than the ones that fall about. So we cannot, buy my story all the way. My story was that the sun is more important than we thought. But this doesn't remove the responsibility from the individual actors. The question is, how responsible are they? And perhaps this humility is very positive, right? Because it makes us all fellow citizens of the world. We have a lot in common with other species in the world. So rather than putting ourselves in the role that we have been in the last 150 years, I'm king, right? And therefore you have to listen to me. This idea of listen to all of us, including what the sun is telling us, makes us a bit more humble and perhaps even friendlier and more collaborative. It's an impression.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point right there. Cynthia, would you care to comment?
Now that you talk about this listening to everybody, this is in part what this session's about, using narratives that, of course, we do use this appreciative inquiry because we try to select what are the things that you could have done better or what you could have done to improve. This part of listening to everybody is what actually creates the possible future of these companies in terms of what they can see. And it's all about taking responsibility because they realize that without the responsibility of everyone, this could not be possible. So this also helps us an exercise of identifying each individual responsibility, but also the collective responsibility that they have.
You know, Cynthia, sometimes I feel sorry for Bill Gates. Not every day, but sometimes.
You're very kind, Alfred. You're very kind.
Because really, I mean, the guy did a lot, and obviously he did very well for himself and for mankind in many ways. But if you stop to think, would the world be better without him? I don't think so. Would the world be better without Henry Ford? Probably not. If you stop to think at the time that Henry Ford was inventing his ways, and I liked very much, Cynthia, your contribution to how society organized themselves to produce. And Ford Model T was actually a very prime example of established procedures to do things in a cheaper way. And that was a time when, you know, people were concerned with the amount of excrements of horses in the city of New York, you know, because you couldn't move around. There were too many horses. And if the city continued to grow and you had more horses, soon you will be swimming in the muck that they left behind. So, you see, it wasn't a solution of Ricardo Jorge just dumping down in the sewage. It was not possible. A new solution had to come up. And Henry Ford has a beautiful sentence, at least attributed to him, that says if he had asked his customers what they wanted for the future, they would have said faster horses. So he didn't ask the customers, he just went and built a new car. Now that led us to other problems, but for about 30 to 50 years it was great.
Thank you, Alfred. Thank you. And now you mentioned Bill Gates, now you mentioned Ford, and we heard earlier about Ricardo Jorge and the role that an individual can play. And my question is, if we can focus on business-related leaders and prominent figures, well, how much do you think these leaders would appreciate a tool like you are proposing, Cynthia? How much would they, I mean, Alfredo kind of already gave a vision of what Bill Gates could say, but how much do you think they would, in fact, learn from this tool?
This is a tool that is very frequently used in businesses. It's one of the most used tools. The problem sometimes with leaders is that they have this overconfidence bias to think that they're better than the rest and that they can have maybe the final saying because they created the company or they own the company, and maybe they think at least that they have better information or better insights. So I think it depends leader to leader. We cannot generalize. There's so many leadership styles and leadership traits that one might have. So it depends. There might be leaders that love consensus and really love to hear the opinions, and others that are completely autocratic and what they want is not to hear from anybody. So I think it just depends.
Okay. Alfredo, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I hope, Cynthia, that you would be right. My personal experience is that the leaders are terrible. Business leaders are terrible at listening to others. I think that they are too overconfident. I would say they're even egocentric, and at times, sometimes they're psychopaths. And we have to really work into that. I mean, I'm not happy with the way that business goes along. There are very few business people that actually have something to say. I don't know about Mexico, Cynthia, but do you have in Mexico business people that speak about something else than their business? Interest rates, the loans that they don't get, the taxes that are too high? I mean, do they think about climate? Do they actually speak out and lead people into a better Mexico? That is pretty. I don't see those in Brazil. I don't see them in Spain. I may be wrong. I don't know them all, nor am I too close friends with them. I don't think they like me very much. I don't know why, but they should hire me more frequently. But, you know, I was recently giving some advice to a company in a country that has lots of separatist movements. I'm not going to mention the country. And the CEO of this company chose a COO, a chief operations officer, from another country. But which country? From a region which is also splintering away from the main country. So you see very confrontational backgrounds. From the mother company, the guy feels comfortable in hiring a guy that didn't speak the same language, no, not the same religion, nothing in common, except the fact that he was also very confrontational. Now, in our societies, Mexico included, Spain, Portugal, Middle East, the whole of Africa, much of Asia, we don't trust people that we don't know. And we prefer to work with people that we like and that make us feel comfortable. It might lead to groupthink. That's a problem. But the fact is that when we are going to hire people, if we hire them from the market, as the American textbooks suggest, you're going to hire people that are competent, but that you don't know, and they won't fit into the culture, certainly not into the teamwork that needs to be done. It will take them 6 months, perhaps a year, if they're lucky. Perhaps they're going to be fired before that because it doesn't work, but largely because we have not respected the way that people want to work with. And people, they need to trust. And in our countries, we are not very good at trusting people that we don't already know.
I think it's not just that we don't know that much. There's not much trust in people with regards to employees. And there's one phenomenon that's going on right now that's called the Great Resignation or the Big Quit, that a lot of people, especially in the United States and in certain countries, are resigning to their works, in part because of the pandemic and all this reconsideration of what work really means and what life means, but also because they feel that they're not being trusted in their jobs. So this aspect of trust is essential for any type of relationship to function properly, especially in businesses.
You know what? I have looked into detail into samba schools in Brazil because they deliver a fantastic show, world class, on the date and time agreed. Everybody rehearsed in their costumes and, you know, dancing and the music. It's fun. It's great to see. But the fantastic thing is that they don't pay those guys. You know, how are they recruited? By affinities. Friends bring in friends, people who they trust, because there are an enormous amount of obstacles to be overcome. And, you know, if you're going to do it for money, it doesn't work. It's been shown. And it's not only Samba schools. Mumbai Dabbawalas of India, you know, they deliver lunch boxes. They have been given their Six Sigma award because they never make mistakes. But they collect lunch boxes at home and they deliver it to the husband that works somewhere else. Very little pay. They dance while they work. They love it. But they all hired along trusting lines. This is what we have to have in mind. So forget about the circadian rhythm for a moment. I think that what is also important is how comfortable people feel with each other, how trusting they can be. I might not be able to go to work today. You have to take my place. I will pay you back tomorrow. Now, ask that to an American managed corporation to see how it works. Oh, no, you're kidding me? I'm just having fun. I love Americans, but their way of behaving and working is not readily accepted in the rest of the world.
On that note, Cynthia, we're talking about different culture, different approaches to how you lead people, right? How much would that cultural factor affect benchmarking? This is a very generic question, I know, but how much is benchmarking affected by cultural differences?
Everything is affected by culture.
Good, I like you.
Everything, because culture has to do with your tradition, your religion, how you, what you eat, the way you dress, how you behave. It's everything. And if we are comparing, for instance, a lot of the benchmarkings are done with companies from another country. Is this really comparable? Because the cultures, in essence, are so different. And businesses all come down to people. And people have different cultures. And then in a company, you have a lot of different subcultures inside, plus the individual cultures. So it's a mix and match. So of course, it's being affected. Every time we do a benchmark, the way you compare, there are a lot of cultural issues at stake. And many of them, we don't even consider them because they're not so visible.
Yes, I agree.
So putting this into the alternative history kind of framework.
Yes, bring us back into that.
No, I think it's quite a nice nuance. Well, so in your two presentations, in your work in progress, so how much would you then consider culture as a factor that might influence the methodology as a whole?
Well, as Cynthia said, you can't do away with that. It's probably the most important factor of all for working collaboratively.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I think it's essential. It's essential. And, you know, as Cynthia says, it's not usually paid enough attention to. I mean, I'm sure there is a lot of discrimination in Mexico, as there is in most of Latin America. In Mexico, the discrimination may be against the native population. In the rest of Latin America, it may be mostly against the Black people that came as slaves. But the fact is that, you know, corporations can't work with all the people. And how much attention do you pay to all the people? Or do we prefer to listen to the people that think and dress like us, as Cynthia was mentioning? This is something that we have to take into account. And it's not related to sunspots. It's not related to circadian rhythms. But if we want to write alternative histories to make people learn from the past and invent the future, knowing what makes you deaf to the comments of others is a first step.
It's very, very interesting. And also going back to your presentation, Alfredo, you've mentioned homicide, but we can also talk about, for example, riots, right?
Yes.
So the effect that the sun has in the individual behavior, and as a political theorist / a philosopher wannabe, I worry a lot about that balance between the individual action and society as a whole. And then we add the companies as another factor, which is made up by individuals and kind of circumvent or try to circumvent some societal norms at times. And we also, obviously we'll have to consider the what if scenario and go back to 1899. And I know that Mario isn't here, but if we think about Ricardo Jorge at the time trying to fight an epidemic, and when he made decisions similar to the decisions most of or some of the leaders in the world had to make in the previous 2 years, when he had to close down the city, close down businesses, close down the essential companies of the city, well, it makes us question how much was the reaction of the people, the violence exerted against Ricardo Jorge, how much can we blame on those people? They were worried about their economical situation. They were worried about their health and their families as well. And if we think about all of these possible external factors, it begs the question of how much can we end up blaming on the individual. And I know that I'm going back to something we've already sort of covered, but it's something that puzzles me a lot, right? And I think it puzzles all of us in a way.
Thank you. It's a very provoking thought. May I try to answer this, Cynthia? Yes?
Absolutely.
Okay, well, it's not an answer. It's actually a conjecture. I think that once we realize that we are not totally responsible for us and we become more humble and we listen more to others, part of the problem will be solved. The other part of the problem is that many people that don't know how to talk to others. So I don't know about this Jorge. Obviously, he did something which was great. But did he know how to speak to the people that did not have his education or could not see it as clearly? Jevons was obviously an outsider in England, and of course everybody laughed at him, but was he good at explaining? Perhaps not as much, you see. Professors or scientists usually believe that they have the whole answer to the problem. And particularly if they are professors, because you're used to grading students and giving them passing marks or not, right? So it's a very non-humble position to be in. And if you need to persuade people who don't know as much or may have a vested interest in being skeptical about your promises, then it makes it all the more difficult. I think that is a problem that we have to take into account. Not always the society is stupid. They have a knowledge of their own, they have an understanding of their own that you have to learn to deal with. I'll give you one example, which I think is beautiful. It comes from Brazil, and they were building a dam to generate electricity. And that dam would create, as they usually do, a large river by constraining the water from flowing down. And the people that were building the dam had the responsibility, difficult responsibility, of telling the people, hey, you have to run away because you will be drowned instead. And the people would listen to them, those know-it-all engineers, and say, no, they don't know it. But why not? Because those people knew that when the river was to grow, it would flood before the cities that were stream above and not below. So this river was going to grow tall from below and not from above. That was against all the knowledge and experience of all my forefathers. So why should I move? These people were probably going to trick me and stay with my land. right? So learning to understand how people think is crucial. We don't have all the answers.
Cynthia, and we are almost running out of time. My last question, and building on what Alfredo just said, well, we've also talked about how leaders or business leaders feel or think that they have all the answers. At times they know that they don't have all the answers, but they have to, or they feel like they have to show that they do. Well, should this question also be should this question be considered when approaching benchmarking the way you are proposing us to do?
The thing is that normally very top level leaders are normally not involved in processes like this, such as benchmarking. Okay. This takes place normally at lower levels where you have specific problems that you want to solve. So they're really not that involved. I'm sure that they're informed of whatever the result was, but normally, at least in my experience, the experiences that I've had, they have never been involved. So it's one step down in the hierarchical structure. Okay. It's more on the hands-on approach of those who have to solve the current problems related either with the product, the processes, the strategy. Okay. But of course, leaders always think they're right.
Yes.
Yeah, and they believe they're right because they have the business right there.
Yeah, so they have the power.
But it's the same thing as you said about the dam. It's like nobody can come and tell me anything. If I built this, I know.
Yes.
Well,
before we finish, I have a question for Alfredo.
Of course, yes.
In this theory that you have, does that position of a country in the globe affects this homicide rate? For example, I'm thinking Mexico, near the equator, very sunny all the time, very high rate of homicides.
I think you're right. Good question. It hasn't been worked out. But what the standard answer to this is that these geomagnetic disturbances affect countries that are in higher latitudes. Now, I don't think that this is probably completely true, but perhaps it is that people have more research stations in those countries.
Okay.
Right? Because I know that they have seen to be important also in South Africa, but that is another cultural problem. You know, South Africa is very culturally, the people that had the power in South Africa, you know, until about 20 years ago, they were very closely knit with the people that spoke English in higher latitudes. So it's something that we have to work out. There is a difference on the impact of the geomagnetic storms depending on the conductivity of the soil. Okay. So it's not only a question of where the research stations are, and they are mostly in the northern hemisphere, but also on how the geomagnetic fields get transmitted. Does that soil have a lot of iron, of uranium? So in order to make the best predictions, we need to consider better the stations that are closer to the areas that we want to use the prediction for.
And can we do something to avoid homicides related to this phenomenon? Can we build a shelter and put the population inside?
Well, that's a beautiful question. That's a beautiful question, because you're right in the sense that, you know, not everybody is a homicide, right? But there might be people that are more prone to committing a homicide. And if we could identify those that are most vulnerable to that situation, perhaps we could devise something to help them. Is there a blood test? Is there a genetic marker? Is there something about the environment in which they live that we should be taking care of? Same for the schizophrenic onsets. You know, there are some people that are schizophrenic because their family have been schizophrenic, but we know that the content, the genetic marker, is about 50%. The rest of the people might have it, but they will not have a psychotic onset. But if they're more prone to have it, how could we help them? Until we recognize that there is a problem, we will not find the solution. For the time being, the people don't even think there is a problem. We are just amongst the first to be dealing with this issue, certainly in homicides. But we need more research, as usual, right? Not to work with yearly data, but with monthly data would be better. But for that, we need the money. If you have the money, speak to me.
I hope that Bill Gates is watching us today and that
Well,
he can email you. I do have to apologize because we just came to the end of our fantastic roundtable.
It's been a great session, and in large part to your help.
No,
Thomas.
I mean I barely spoke. It's not. I'm just here to
No,
introduce you. I'm merely MC. Thank you so much.
You're very humble. Cynthia, I would love to keep in touch with you. And Tomás, if you have any power in this thing, I would like to have the copy of the record of this exchange.
Of course, I will ask. I will ask the organization to provide you.
And just one last word. This is work in the making, and it's not only mine.
Yeah.
Okay. Crucial to say so.
Well,
thank you very, very much. Thank you very, very much for the organizers, to Anna, the Faculty of Beautiful Arts, or whatever you call it in English, right?
Well, thank you so much, Alfredo, Cynthia, Mário, who sadly had to leave us earlier. The sessions will be available, I've been told, on the YouTube. I will send the link via email to our fantastic speakers.
I believe that the link is already on the chat.
Oh, perfect, perfect. And I mean, I was also take just 1 minute to give a quick thanks to the organization, and especially to Professor Anna, because she's been inviting me all these years, and I'm just very, very happy to be a part of this fantastic project. And like it's a custom of me in these panels that I've been fortunate enough to moderate, I'd like to finish off with a quote. And 2 years ago, I congratulated Jorge Jesus when he was managing in Brazil. So this today will be slightly different. And I would like to quote Nelson Mandela for that matter. And he said, "If you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his own language, that goes to his heart." And without any further word, once again, thank you so much to our speakers, Alfredo, Cynthia, Mário. And I hope to see you soon in person and in the beautiful city of Porto, if possible.
That would be great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And mind you, when those things on the chat disappear when this is disabled.
Yes.
So please send us the link. Okay.
Yeah, of course, that will be there.
Cynthia, bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tomás.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.